We start with Fiona and Paul. Do you just want to briefly introduce yourselves for the record? Should we start with you, Fiona?
Thank you. I'm Fiona Clouder. I'm the former regional ambassador for Latin America and the Caribbean for COP26 and the former ambassador to Chile. I now work as an independent consultant, including for Appian Capital Advisory, who are a major investor in the mining sector.
I know you've gone back to calling it Chile.
Yes.
Chile to Chile and then back to Chile. We've been on that same course as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Chair. My name is Paul Atherley. I'm the founder of a company called Tees Valley Lithium that's developing a large lithium processing facility in Teesside. I'm also the founder and chairman of a company called Pensana, which is developing a rare earth mine in Angola and a rare earth processing facility in Humber.
Right. Thank you very much. Henry Smith, over to you.
Thank you very much. Do you feel that the UK government's critical minerals strategy meets the priorities that the government have set out on critical minerals and in achieving wider policy aims in terms of the geopolitics, but also tangible ways that the Foreign Office can support that? That's to both of you. I'll start, if I may, with you, Fiona.
Well, first of all, I think it was a very positive step to see this strategy and also the critical minerals refresh. The focus, though, seems to be very much on the supply chain side, which is, of course, a vital problem and the subject of your inquiry. I suppose I see this coming also from my environmental background as ultimately, why are we doing this? It's ultimately to ensure the energy transition to address climate change. So I would have liked to have seen the strategy consider much more of the generic issues, because this is a far more complex problem than just the supply chains of the critical minerals. And in taking that forward, my interest is very much on the international side. It's obviously very good to see the references to international partnerships. And since submission of the written evidence earlier this year, of course, a lot of progress has been made with agreements with some of the key countries. But I feel what's not articulated at the moment is that broader international engagement, both to address the supply chain issue, but also to see this as a major foreign policy issue because of the wider geopolitics involved.
Okay, thank you. Paul, what's your perspective on that?
Thanks, Mr. Smith. I agree very much with what Fiona's saying. Is there's a bigger issue here in our understanding of the refresh. It's going to look at how we can accelerate UK domestic development through the ATF and things like the Faraday Challenge. So it's also going to look at the collaborations that Fiona mentioned, things like through the Mineral Security Partnership, and I've recently been in Australia with Innovate UK, talking to Australian companies to see whether we can connect directly. But specifically on the point that Fiona makes about enhancing the international markets for the bigger picture, this relates to ESG. And I think if we look at it more holistically, if I can step into an area which hasn't been covered, and that is the dominant player, i.e. China, dominates the midstream, dominates the processing. The mining itself, for most of the commodities, is increasingly diversifying. And we look at that midstream, there's the supply chain resilience factor, there's the ESG factor that Fiona mentioned. We've got to be sure that the minerals we bring here are sourced sustainably. But there's another factor as well I think is incredibly important. And if we can reflect back, I think this country has took us during the Industrial Revolution from sort of steam to steel. The US took us from petrochemicals to plastics. Right now, China's taking us from critical minerals to chemicals. And we're undergoing a chemical revolution. And right now, China is, whoever's going to lead the energy transition is the country that leads the chemical engineering revolution. So I would say, in terms of the policy, yes, it's focusing very much on supply chain resilience to the UK consumer. I think we need to look much more broadly about how the UK can participate in this electrochemical revolution that's happening, not in this country, happening somewhere else.
In terms of supply chains, do you think that our allies and partners understand the UK's what we have to offer in that respect?
If I could answer that, I was in Australia in February, and I met with the peak industry bodies, the peak academic bodies, and I was at a lithium round table with the Federal Minister for Resources, Madeleine King, also with the West Australian Resources Minister. And the question was, in face of the opportunities that were presented by the Inflation Reduction Act, with all the incentives being presented around the world, the question to me was, what has the UK got to offer? Yeah. My answer, Mr. Smith, was chemical parks and bad weather. We have a very deeply developed chemicals industry here, and we also have one of the fastest growing offshore wind industries. Right now we have connected to two of the biggest chemical parks in the world, that's at Teesside and Humber, two HVDC cables being laid as we speak from the world's biggest offshore wind farm, Dogger Bank. So we have an electric, renewable power being connected directly to chemical parks. So I said to the Australians, rather than mine, Western Australia produces 55% of the world's lithium. So I said, rather than mine lithium at 5%, putting it on a boat, loading up ships with 95% waste, sending it to China, decarbonise the car industry, why not add value to your product in Australia, take it to a 50% primary lithium sulfate, and export to chemical parks in the UK that can use 100% renewable offshore wind and produce a value-added product to supply the European market. So very much offering the case that the UK can offer this electrochemical midstream to our strategic partners like the Australians.
Thank you. And Fiona, if I may also sort of ask you on supply chains, do you feel that the UK government are moving in the right direction of sufficiently diversifying supply chains?
Yes, I think there is clear strategic progress towards that. I also feel that the strategy focuses very much on the narrow definition of critical minerals and respect that it says this is going to be kept under review. But again, if we take this back to the bigger problem of the energy transition, that's about far more than just the critical minerals. It's also the enormous expansion of base materials that are needed, copper, nickel, etc. And so if we think about climate change and all the commitments that were made in Glasgow by countries all over the world to radically reduce emissions by 2030, which we need to get to net zero by 2050, people have worked out that to make those 2030 targets, we need to go 5 times faster. Now, there's a whole issue about the policies not happening fast enough all over the world, but to go 5 times faster, you basically need 5 times more stuff to make it happen, and that's beyond just the critical minerals, say, needed for battery technology, etc. So I feel we also need to look at that and to talk to countries around the world, and also to treat this as a generic global issue, as well as looking at individual countries' positions and competitiveness in this space.
You anticipate my next question, just a real brief answer, if I may. Do you think that the UK strategy is achievable and realistic?
If it was just the UK in this space, possibly. I think the real issue is, of course, everybody else is at this game, and to be honest, in many cases are way ahead of us. And also we are, with respect to a small nation and a small voice, and going back to the point you made very well, I've also had many people say to me, but what is the UK doing? Both what is it doing and what is its offer? So whatever we're doing or saying, we're not saying it loud enough for potential partners to then make us the partner of choice.
Any final thoughts on that last point about realism the strategy?
I think being realistic about what we can offer. We can offer midstream processing. It doesn't mean we have to offer midstream to be able to create a product to go all the way to batteries and electric vehicles, or we can produce a midstream product that fits into somebody else's supply chain. So, for instance, very, very clearly the Atlantic Declaration that was announced the other day said that the UK companies can participate to $3,750 per ton of battery materials that get processed in the UK. In other words, we can be part of the supply chain without necessarily it being the supply chain all the way through. So I think if we think more holistically, as Fiona was saying, it was how can we be part of the bigger solution, then the bit we have to offer is chemical parks and bad weather.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much. Drew.
Yeah, thank you. Notwithstanding Paul's comments, in fact, actually taking them into account, what are the benefits of clearly, what are the benefits, if any, I should say, are there of clearly articulating to the public the dependency on mining to meet green transition goals? Does the public need to understand the trade-offs?
I think very much so, and I think that's another big part of the issues that need to be looked at. So, first of all, there's a very low level of public understanding at all. People don't realise their cars, their mobile phones, the very buildings they're in rely on mining. So actually spreading awareness of the contribution mining makes, both to our society and the world we live in, but also to global supply chains for all sorts of products across the world and how that benefits both our society and our economy. I think that's very important. There's also issues around public perceptions of mining that traditionally seen as a very dirty, very destructive industry, and we have to be realistic about aspects of that. But there's also about turning that narrative round to get people to understand that mining is an essential feature of the world in the future if we're going to make the energy transition and address climate change. So how can there be ways of doing this in a more energy efficient, in a more sustainable way, in a cleaner way, and in a way that also benefits people?
Look, I fully agree with everything that Fiona is saying. I would just add to that, I think we've got to talk more about the magic of these metals that we produce. I sponsor a young lady through University College London who's now working, I sponsor her through STEM, and she's now working on Max Verstappen's Formula One car. And she took me out for lunch the other day and said, you know, I now get your industry. Formula One car is not just about a powerful engine, a light wind tunnel, designed body. It's about materials and metals. It's about graphite that can dissipate heat away from brake discs. She went on at length and talked about all the metals, and specifically about rare earths, permanent magnets. And rare earth permanent magnets, you know, the only reason why an electric vehicle moves is not the lithium-ion battery, it's the permanent magnets inside the axial motor. And hearing it from her, she could see the magic in the metals. She could see the magic in the story. Just one other small story along those lines. We think about electric vehicles in terms of transition from internal combustion engines. Electric vehicles, most buyers of electric vehicles in the future are going to be young women. And they see a completely different set of characteristics of that vehicle. Number one, it doesn't have to stop at a petrol station, leaving the kids in the back of the car. And for those of you who are in the public eye, you don't get papped in a petrol station. So the point being, and I think if we can share to the public, to Fiona's point, a bit about the magic of these metals that we produce, and a little bit about the benefits they bring to society, and less about the provenance, then we've got a much better chance of bringing people on side to support what we're doing.
Let me ask you one very quick follow-up question from that. Is the UK government doing enough to explain the need for critical minerals for our industry, to stakeholders, indeed to the public themselves? Are they doing enough of that?
I would say no, because the UK government is brilliant in behavioural economics and nudge theories and things. And I think we've got to get out there and have different voices to people like me, maybe young STEM students from university, maybe young mothers, and talk about the magic of this energy transition. It's going to change all our lives, and it's only going to happen because of these critical minerals that we're going to mine and process and produce and put into these products. So let's get somebody out there via the government talking about this. And the UK can lead this. We can be right at the front of the electrochemical revolution. We've got chemical parks, we've got offshore wind, we've got the power, we've got the government policies. We're just not translating that into something that says this is special and we can lead it.
Okay. Fiona, any comments on that?
Yes, and I think it's both from within government, but it's also about having a collective voice. It's about working with the industry, it's about working with communities. And also I think this is not just a message in the UK. As Paul has said, the UK can have a very powerful voice around the world, because these are challenges facing countries all around the world, and particularly those countries with the very resources that are needed for the supply chains. So part of the UK offer in building some of the partnerships can also be about building that public dialogue and looking at whole issues around community relations, social license to operate.
Okay.
I'll come to Graham in a second, but can I just challenge you on this a bit? Because I represent a former mining constituency, coal mining, and whilst it employed 160,000 men at its peak, an awful lot of people suffered. A lot of people were killed in the mines, poor standards of hygiene, lots of people had lots of ongoing health conditions which lasted for many, many years. And the end result is deprivation and poverty in an area of the country which has been very difficult to overcome. When we were in Chile, we saw there were quite a lot of complaints from indigenous communities about lithium being extracted in a way that they didn't think was sustainable.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right in everything you've said. It's about an issue of building back trust and about showing a narrative on how this can be different in the future. So I think it's very important that both government and industry are realistic and honest about what has gone on in the past. There have been all sorts of terrible, of course, ecological disasters. One thinks of the tailings dam in Brazil, for example. And historically, and particularly in Latin America, mining is associated with social conflict with communities. What I think is interesting in Chile is that they are very conscious of this and trying to build better relations with communities and doing this at the start. And I was very interested. I was in a recent seminar with people from Canada, talking to the indigenous leaders there, who held both the land rights for mining resources, but also a lot of knowledge about the land. And they were saying how important it had been to be involved right from the start when a mining project is contemplated, and to turn this into a win-win for the community, so that the community actually gains not just in terms of jobs, but in terms of social benefit. So, for example, going back to Chile and Antofagasta, that's generally perceived as not a great place to be, apart from the heat, but simply because it's not a city or town with great facilities. And many of the workers just bus in and out or fly in and out as quickly as possible. So there's something about developing mining projects, of which there needs to be an enormous expansion if we're going to make the energy transition, but doing that in a way that benefits the communities, and also doing it in a way that is sustainable with nature and biodiversity, which is a whole other area of challenge.
And Paul, if I might to you, just about recycling, because when we asked in Chile whether any of this lithium was ever going to be recycled, they said, well, it's not really very cost effective. So we're just going to end up with a great big mountain of former lithium batteries.
Recycling is difficult because lithium's used in car industry, and the cars make products that are not designed to be taken apart. So I'll give you two answers. One is, in many of the other metals, there's increasing amounts of recycling going on. I'll give you an example for our rare earth processing facility in the UK. We're working with Equinor, those offshore wind turbines that are going into the North Sea at Dogger Bank. They've got 7 tons of permanent magnets. They're going to bring them down, take them apart, demagnetize them, give them to us, and then we're going to use the hydrogen that they produce to decrepitate them, turn them back into metal hydride and oxide and recycle them. So we design that process up front. The specific challenge in lithium is that lithium goes into batteries in cars, and I would suggest to you one of the things that the car industry can do is have legislation such that end-of-life vehicle usage directives are that all the components of cars can come apart very easily. So with lithium batteries, they get turned into a thing called black mass, basically crushed up, and then there's several processes to remove all the metals.
Okay.
So agree with you, we're not recycling as much as we could, but I would say it's a design function, not a processing function.
Okay, that's...
Perhaps I might also add a comment. I think it's also that it will become more economic as the pressure grows on supply chains and costs and difficulty of accessing materials. There are initiatives going on around the world that are starting to look more seriously at recycling. So I think some of the technology involved in that is also important. And again, that could be another part of the UK offer in expertise on how to do this sort of thing.
Okay, Graham.
Just following up Chris's question, wouldn't taking out the built-in obsolescence of cars help rather more if you extended their lifetime by twice or 3 times as long, rather than the 3.5, 4 years that it is at the moment?
Yes, that would reduce the demand. I mean, the transition from internal combustion engine to electric vehicles is not just cars, it's coming across all forms of motive power. So when we talk about critical minerals, it's all of that, and the longer life you have, the better. An example would be these offshore wind turbines, typically designed for 10 or 15 years, they will last for a lot longer. So yes, that will remove the demand for us. But if I can just pick up on that and just go somewhere else with it just very, very quickly. One of the things we've got to do, and it's what you're driving at, we've got to value these metals and minerals more. We've got to say that stop treating them as commodities that are disposable. We've got to say that they're actually worth paying for because of the properties up front, but also worth recycling. So we've got to make them more valuable rather than treating them as the lowest cost denominator that they can be extracted out of the ground for. And that's something that the UK can do. And I'll throw it back to you and say we've done it with other commodities. We've done it through things like fair trade coffee. We've done it through chocolate. We've done it through a range of other commodities where we've agreed to pay more for the product because we value it more. So I'll suggest to you the best way we can treat these critical minerals to get them recycled is to put a value on them, a brand around them, and make people pay more for them.
I mean, it's good to see your investment in rare earth processing in the northeast. What percentage of the worldwide industry of processing rare earths does that represent?
Around 5%.
Around 5%. That's from essentially nothing. Do you think we should go the extra mile and start surveying for rare earths and mining for rare earths in this country? Because the thing about rare earths is they're not rare, are they?
No, short answer is no. I think there are other countries with better geological endowment for all these critical minerals that we need to form partnerships with. And as I mentioned, I just come back from several trips to Australia, and I'll give you one example. Pilbara Minerals has got a mine in the northern part of Western Australia. Its expansion it announced earlier this year, that single expansion, that single mine, is more than all the critical minerals that we've got potentially that we can develop in the UK. So let's accept the fact that South America, Africa, Australia, and North America, all of which have countries which we can build strategic collaborations with, can provide all the supply we need. We need to focus on the bit where we can add value, which is chemical parks, bad weather, and everything that Fiona's saying about applying the highest possible standards of life cycle analysis, REACH regulations, rules of origin, recycling, so that we create a product that is a higher value than a straight commodity, and therefore we create longer life for them and people appreciate them more.
Has the UK made any progress through the Minerals Security Partnership in improving the standards in critical mining worldwide?
Again, I'll defer to Fiona's knowledge of what's happening in South America, and I can speak more about Africa and and Western Australia, there's absolutely no question that the Minerals Security Partnership has made countries aware of creating these realigned supply chains. And realigned supply chains means you need mines to be developed, you need infrastructure, you need finance. And so in countries in Africa, the US government had been visiting those countries, which would normally be visited by China, and saying, we can help you develop your resources. The US has also been courting Australia very heavily through the Inflation Reduction Act. So the Mineral Security Partnership has unquestionably created new supply chains or pathways for new supply chains. My question back to you is, we are part of it, but we're not taking any lead in it. We're not doing the same thing.
But has it improved standards and governance?
Absolutely.
Can you give us some examples?
Well, all the agencies that provide the money, the Department of Energy, the UK Export Finance, all these people have the highest standards of ESG requirement for you to draw down those loans, to draw down those facilities. So anywhere where money comes through that channel, you can see you cannot draw that money down until you meet those requirements.
Right. I was looking more for figures in terms of, to take Chris's point, reduced accidents, reduced deaths, reduced chronic diseases, those sort of areas in the mining industry.
Possibly a little early to measure all those. I'm very familiar with the coal industry stats in the UK. My father was the first professor of occupational health and safety in this country, and when I was a student, I spent my time in Birmingham Central Library looking up coal mining deaths and statistics, so I'm familiar with those. Now, I think the answer to is and I'll pick up on Fiona's point, is the best way to design a mine so that it's safe, it's sustainable, it's secure, provides all the things you want, is to design it in from the beginning. And I would say to you, Graham, we haven't seen any evidence of that yet, but it's early. It's too early. But if that comes with the money, then that's the best way to set it up.
Okay. Just a last question along these lines. China produces, in what I'm told, are appalling conditions, most of the rare earths that are in use. Where should we prioritise our alliances to try and improve things? Should we stop buying Chinese rare earths? Should we prioritise our partnerships elsewhere?
Look, I completely agree with the issue about we should stop buying we should not be bringing any raw material into the UK or Europe that's been extracted unsustainably to be part of our transition, any transition. And the way we do that is we have a thing called life cycle analysis. There are companies here in the UK, one's called Minviro. They go out and they do an audit of the supply chain from the mine to the magnet, or from the mine to the battery, and they provide a report to the customer to say this has been sourced sustainably, and here is some quantification of the embedded carbon all the way through. So when you talk to car companies now, they talk to you about transparency, they talk to you about life cycle analysis, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions, and finally the amount of low embedded carbon. So the answer is we should not be buying any products, but particularly consumer-facing products, that doesn't have a life cycle analysis. And that would simply stop at the doorstep materials that can't provide that.
Specifically, would that stop us trading with China in rare earths?
With rare earths, the biggest issue with rare earths right now is Global Witness reported that a lot of the specialist rare earths, the heavies, are coming from northern Myanmar. And it's effectively a form of sort of ecocide. The Chinese businesses are crossing the border and bringing these materials into China. They get lost in the Chinese supply chain, and they end up in our cars and our wind turbines. Our argument is that every single mine, every single supplier should have a life cycle analysis audit before you can buy that product. So when you buy that car or you get electricity from that wind turbine, it is all certified. And I'll give you a more detailed example of that, is that my company, Pensana, has signed a deal with Polestar Zero. And they've got this moonshot goal to produce the world's first climate-neutral electric vehicle by 2030. And the way they're doing that is every single bit of the raw material that goes into that car has a supply chain that's signed off on. So there is a very good precedent. And the idea there is that Polestar is owned by Volvo. Volvo in the 1970s created seatbelts and safety cages and gave that to the world. What Polestar is doing now is saying, this is how all cars should be. So I would say to you, it's up to us not to buy the products that can't be validated. Create those standards ourselves. It's something that the UK can do. And again, we've done it in other supply chains. We should not turn a blind eye to this in critical raw materials.
Okay, Fiona, do you want to just... Sorry, we've got somebody coming online in a couple of minutes, Graham, unless you want...
Can I ask Fiona one question?
Yeah.
It goes back to the points you were making about partnerships and this country leading on climate change. My question is that China are creating more carbon dioxide. Germany is switching off its nuclear power and turning to coal. One can go through India and South Africa, where they're not really aiming for net zero by 2050. How does that fit in with any partnerships and alliances?
I think you've hit the nail on the head. So certainly the world is not meeting the commitments it made in Glasgow. The ramifications of that are very serious. The UN will be doing the global stock take, looking at how well or badly countries are doing on all those commitments. But one of my observations that is perhaps very pertinent to this inquiry is that the environment world and the mining world and the energy world are all their own echo chambers. So they're all conscious of this agenda and they're all working on different aspects of it, but they don't really seem to talk to one another in an integrated way. And I think that, again, is a real opportunity, because one of the things the UK is good at doing is acting as a convener and bringing together different sectors, bringing together different countries. So if we're serious about these partnerships, it's, again, going back to where I started, about looking at this as a total issue, looking at the contribution mining makes, looking at the contribution within that supply of critical minerals makes, but asking, challenging, and also helping countries to address this as a broader issue. So on your point on ESG standards, this is something we can really help, for example, countries in Latin America on. Because one of the big problems and a kind of dilemma is we need a vast increase in mines and mining materials to make that energy transition. A mine takes over a decade, perhaps I think 16 years is the average, to go from discovery through to actual production. Way, way too late to actually meet all these great commitments that have been made. A big part of that is addressing the environmental and other standards and the community consultation. So a challenge is, how do you ensure that the rigour of those standards, which is so very, very important, is maintained, but how do you optimise that process? And some of that goes back to skills and capacity in the countries that have these resources. And again, that's a partnership opportunity for the UK.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to both of you. I'm afraid time is always against us. As you just said, 16 years, it takes a long time, but you've managed to crack through lots of answers that we needed for our inquiry in just over 30 minutes. So well done. Thank you very much for your time.